For many Austinites, life looks different under the Trump administration than it did before. Texas leads the United States in ICE detentions with more than 13,000 arrests, and that's a number that Governor Greg Abbott expects will keep going up. So today on CityCast Austin, we're hearing from a local reporter to find out where enforcement is taking place, how Austin's elected officials are responding, and why, for some, the drive to San Antonio is absolutely terrifying. It's Monday, September 29th. I'm Eva Ruth Moravec, in for Nikki Devon, and this is what Austin's talking about. Hello, this is Eva Ruth. I'm in for Nikki, and I'm here today with Emiliano Tahui Gomez. He is the Latino Communities reporter for the Austin American-Statesman. So under President Donald Trump, immigration enforcement has been expanded, the southern border has been closed, and humanitarian relief for immigrants has been limited. And here in Austin, what would you say is the most visible example of the impact of some of those policies on people living here?
I think here in Austin, the way we're seeing immigration enforcement most visibly would be very often, I think, through DPS. I mean, we're seeing a strong presence of DPS in certain immigrant-heavy neighborhoods. For example, the Rumberg-Lamar area would be one very good example, but also at times Southeast Austin. And what we're seeing is often that during what are often traffic stops or described as traffic stops by DPS, if an individual is found to not have the legal status to be in this country, DPS is quickly communicating with ICE and arrests are happening. And from when I talk to activists, to individuals themselves who are in this country without status, to them, in their minds, that is what they feel most present. As in, like, when it comes to commuting to work, for example, if you're an individual who has to think about this, it's the idea of, will DPS decide to stop me for something in my car, and will that lead to an arrest, to ICE being called in quickly and ICE coming in to make arrests. Besides that, and this is perhaps less visible unless you are the families themselves, but is often the presence of immigration, or the risk, I should say, of immigration enforcement during ICE check-ins or court visits, which are very much a result of the current administration's decisions of how to enact enforcement and where to enact enforcement and who needs to be detained. And we're seeing that very often in San Antonio because we don't have an immigration court. We don't have an ICE check-in center here in Austin. But if you're an Austin family that is living through some sort of court case or, has some sort of pending status, I mean, this is part of your lives. This is my court date or my check-in date is going to be at this date. I'm planning for this. And we see many families, and we at the Statesman have reported about, what does it mean to be planning for this visit to San Antonio where you don't know necessarily how you are going to be received and if ICE is going to decide that you're somebody that they're going to detain.
Yeah, if you're going to make it home. I mean, I want to get into some of the reporting in a minute that you've done on those examples of, people just going to their regular check-in appointments and then being just taken away. Are people skipping? Have you heard about people being fearful and skipping their appointments? Or is the impact of that even worse than, what might happen at a check-in appointment?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have heard of that and have heard that from not only individuals, but activists who kind of who have a broader sense and are helping many individuals at one point. But I will say, I think that is, in a sense, there's a longer history to that of individuals who don't, might feel like they're in a position where their case might not be going in the direction they want, and they just stop showing up. I mean, that is, in a sense, why we have had the large number of undocumented or individuals without legal status that we've had to this point. And that was, in a sense, part of the complaint of those who were frustrated with immigration or even anti-immigration was this idea of it's too easy for individuals to skip out of the process. And obviously on the converse side, the argument was, these individuals are skipping out because they don't see a way through in this process. They don't see a process that can necessarily, for a lot of them, did not see a process that could be worked through. And so, for example, I mean, even in my previous reporting before Trump had been put into office, I would commonly run into or report about individuals in a non-immigration way who had stopped showing up, for example, to their immigration cases because they realized if they kept showing up, they were going to be deported. But I just to say, I think, the risk can vary. I mean, if you show up to one check-in, for example, and get a some sort of ankle brace or some sort of monitor, then you can no longer skip out, and then you will continue to return until either your case is done with or ICE decides to put you into the detention system and process you for deportation. And so I think that that's a question that different people or different individuals in the situation are going to interact with differently, just because they are going to run different risks. But it's very much a question that seems to be front of the mind of so many individuals who are still going through their processes.
Right, of course. And then, and just to reiterate, like in the past, the difference is that those appointments, they were part of the process that was leading somewhere. And now it seems like what that process is and the various steps, like how legitimate they are, is kind of up in the air. But is that right?
I think it's fair to say that when we were seeing so many people grabbed at check-ins at immigration hearings and arrested, that very quickly spread as a common understanding. I mean, I followed Congressman Kassar, right, when he went down to San Antonio to the immigration court, and saw him interact with the individuals who had decided to show up to their court case. And I sat in a courtroom where some people had decided not to show up or had tried to find ways to come in virtually to avoid being there in person. And then I saw the individuals who came in person be arrested right after their cases were dismissed. And I saw wives and mothers crying, telling me that they had told their husband or their, it was all men, and it often seems to be, but telling that they had told their partners not to show up, and their partners had decided, or their husbands or their sons or whatnot had decided to show up and try to go through the legal process. And then as a result, ended up through processing.
And you mentioned DPS, that's the Texas Department of Public Safety, and I guess is that's a change because of the enforcement agencies now that are enforcing immigration laws. Like, were we seeing that kind of participation between DPS and ICE previously?
I think what we can be certain about is that we've seen a growth in that collaboration, as it's been explained to me by lawyers who keep an eye on the changing immigration policy federally, but also here in Texas, where we have a state that wants to be very active in playing a role in immigration enforcement. I mean, for example, the state troopers, the Texas DPS, have not signed a 287G agreement, which is often what we hear about in terms of counties specifically. Local law enforcement agencies could technically be either decide to or be forced to by the state through a law like Senate Bill 8 to collaborate and ask or about immigration status and help ICE detain people who are found without legal status. But in DPS, it's a bit different, even though they seem to be some of the most aggressive players right now in collaboration, because they from my understanding, it comes from executive orders and orders coming from the governor's office himself to help. And so I think because of that, and also because in a sense, seemingly troopers are being moved away from the border and back towards the interior of the state. And this kind of represents really what we've seen nationally, right? Which is this idea of immigration enforcement is moving away from the border now that there's many less encounters at the border and many less detainments at the border. And it's the idea of enforcement has to happen inside the country with individuals who are already here and therefore likely have established lives, might have families. But this is, in the eyes of both the presidential administration and the governor's administration and many legislators, what has to be happening. And so we're seeing the effects of that. We're seeing much higher risk for individuals who live in Austin, which is, as you know, many more than 100 miles from the border. And so farther from that traditional area where we've seen enforcement during past years.
So there's there's less stuff for them to do on the border. So they're kind of spreading out, and obviously they can go wherever they want to in the state. Their jurisdiction is statewide. You mentioned Runberg-Lamar corridor. You've also written about an immigration raid, an ICE raid at a construction site in central Austin. Where else in the city are we seeing activity, arrests being made within Austin?
Yeah, I want to be a bit clear on the arrests that I reported about. From what I heard from individual men, laborers who were on the site after those arrests, as they understood it, and through the little information we could get from DPS had followed that car and stopped them by the site, right in front of their work site. And so they had arrested a group of many men as they were being brought by a contractor onto the worksite. And as I've spoken to some activists here in Austin who do try to keep up with laborers and work sites, that is something that they've seen is that when there's a vehicle that looks like it might carry large amounts of individuals, that looks like it might be going to a work site, they believe that those are being targeted by the state. And so that is definitely a type of arrest that I've heard plenty about, that I know several examples, decent sized examples of. And then, yes, through areas where state troopers have decided to increase their presence, which is, as we mentioned, the Lamar Runberg area. Those are two of the big ones that I've really heard about. Besides, that's what and this is something that I think is very interesting. And I've spoken to, for example, the Mexican consulate about this, but still a decent sized number of the arrests are coming when individuals are going down in San Antonio. And maybe that will continue to change as people feel less and less comfortable, as we've already seen beginning in the summer, going down to their court dates and going down to their ICE check-in dates, which are these sort of set dates, either yearly or every other year, or twice a year, I should say, that immigrants might have to check in saying, I have the status, but the federal government requires me to come in and present myself and then show kind of where I am. And traditionally, those were very routine sort of check-ins.
Risk.
They were considered low risk. But now, and I mean, I could give one of the examples of something we've written about, and that's the case of a father here who lived just outside of Austin, from my understanding, and had one son in the military, another son who had just graduated from high school, from Del Valley High School, and was set to join the military in a week or two right after his graduation. And while his son kind of goes away for a week on this trip that he had planned to celebrate his graduation from high school, his father goes down to San Antonio on what is supposed to be a routine check-in, and is arrested by ICE. And rightly, ICE will say that the father, who had immigrated at about the age of 17 or 18 from what records had shown from Mexico to the U.S. and committed a burglary crime when he was 17 or 18, and then had been stopped once since by officers as well, and had a record, was stopped and was told by ICE, even though he had not had a record in the past 30 years, that was enough for them to say that he's no longer somebody who is wanted in the country, and therefore is being set up to be deported. And I believe he actually has his court case, what appears to be his final court case coming up. There are many of these stories that I've encountered with many different families here in the Austin area. I think this was an interesting case because it really was a family sort of trying to grasp and make sense of what identity was. I mean, it was this idea of, we raise our sons to be American. They want to prove this as this maybe a historical idea of, you prove your Americanness, your Americanity by serving in the military, by finding a way to serve the country. And these
what more patriotic thing could you do?
Exactly. And in the minds of many Hispanic Americans, this has been a way to show that, right? And for these two sons, first for the eldest, and now it was about to be for the second, though he's decided that he's still kind of trying to make sense of whether he's going to join now that his father has been detained, particularly because his mother doesn't feel as comfortable with it anymore. To me, that was a very interesting question about kind of, how do newcomers to this country try to show that they are integrating into this country, right? And to what extent will that be accepted by this country nowadays?
Right. His name is Eric Gonzalez Mendez.
Yes.
And his case is still kind of up in the air. There's also, here on the podcast, we've talked about a dog handler, a local dog handler who recently made the news, who also had gone to his routine check-in. I didn't realize that those were all being done in San Antonio. So that's good context to know that you actually have to get in a vehicle and go down to this site where you don't know if you're ever going to come back.
This podcast is brought to you by Wise, the app for international people using money around the globe. With Wise, you can send, spend, and receive up to 40 currencies with only a few simple taps, and save up to 55% compared to major banks. Plus, Wise won't add hidden fees to your transfer. Whether you're buying souvenirs with pesos in Puerto Vallarta or sending euros to tip your Coliseum tour guide, you know you're getting a fair exchange rate with no extra markups. That's what makes Wise the fast, affordable way to use your money around the globe. Wise offers 24/7 live support and runs over 7 million daily checks to catch and prevent fraud. So you know your money is where it's supposed to be. Be smart. Join the 15 million customers who choose Wise. Download the Wise app today or visit wise.com. Learn more by visiting wise.com/US/compare. T's and C's apply.
Do we know any numbers locally of arrests being made, as well as how many are happening in these check-in kinds of appointments? And where are you getting numbers these days also?
Yeah.
Because it's just confusing.
I mean, numbers are difficult to get because, for example, we have record requests to ICE from February, from those first weeks of what ICE called at the time targeted enforcement actions here in Austin, when we really saw the first movements of at the time it was ICE agents and ICR agents coming in and finding people leaving their apartments or going to work and arresting them because they already had some sort of deportation order or they were listed on some sort of list. And from then, just to go back to that, it's because we put in record requests then trying to replicate stories that the Statesman had done back in 2017 during the first Trump administration, where the Statesman had tried to check the criminal records and see how many individuals had criminal records, how many didn't.
Right, because that was the initial narrative that President Trump was saying, like, we're going after these bad people that kind of everybody can get on board with them not being here.
Yes, this is the idea. This was the supposed policy proposal given to some extent during the election, which was, President Trump vote for him because he cares about taking out criminals out of the country. And this was repeated, especially at the beginning of the first month of the administration. And this is all to go back to that of we put in record requests, have not, despite getting our lawyer involved, gotten responses. And this is very common throughout the country at the moment. I think a reporter from the Columbia Journalism Review has reached out to me and to many other reporters as they're writing a story on this, because this is pretty widely known. For us here at the Statesman, and I think maybe national publications have a different reach to their ability to perhaps reach different sources. But there are some academics or just researchers who have done a really good job trying to find, and at times this has come through leaks, but getting data on, what are these numbers that we're seeing? And then not only that, who are these individuals? Because there's one thing to just get the broad numbers of who the federal government is saying they've detained or keeping detained and then eventually deporting. And there's another thing of getting the numbers of, for example, what percentages of these individuals had some sort of record, right? Whether that be previous, like a violent criminal record, or had a record because they had been in this country without status previously and been arrested and been deported. And we wrote about that a bit. We had a story earlier this year that I wrote about the federal courthouse here and the effort by how we were seeing it here locally of the efforts of federal prosecutors to indict and then charge individuals with what is called illegal reentry, which would basically make them felons, even though it doesn't always come with a very strong jail sentence. Very often they're being convicted of this and then being deported. As I followed a man here in the Austin area who had been arrested, detained, had been detained actually when he came in to help DPS with an investigation about his job site, had no record on his own, but had been found that he had been in this country and been deported previously before, and then they charged him, made him a convicted felon, and deported him back to his home country. And so those numbers have been interesting. And we have some access to some local ones when they go through the legal system like that, but oftentimes they don't. And in a sense, we are trying to make sense of how do we assess the numbers the federal government is giving us. And they're hard to localize because they don't really publish them at micro levels like county or like a city. So those numbers are not easy to get. The closest that I can often see are state numbers and then federal numbers, unless something else comes out.
There are real impacts of these arrests, these detentions, the fear, I think, that so many people in the immigrant community right now must be living with, whether it's being able to drive to your job site or take your kid to school. You wrote an excellent story on Guerrero Thompson Elementary, where there's been an increase in law enforcement presence, and that's caused a lot of fear. I'm curious if you have any bigger perspective of Austin Independent School District and kind of how they are managing, addressing, speaking to the fear that AISD families may have, whether they're here legally or not, because it does seem we've heard stories that, we've read stories. These are actual reported stories of people who have legal status who are still getting arrested or detained and then have to go through the process of proving that they are legally here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess to answer the part of your question about kind of schools and how these conversations are being had with children or with kind of communities themselves, I think what I found most interesting while reporting was really how those conversations are being had and really being kind of organized and sort of thought of at the most sort of local levels, in the sense that, like, for example, if we can talk about schools, when parents have these questions or when kids have these questions, I mean, who answers them? It's not always or not even usually that the district superintendent or higher up in the district. It's going to be the teachers, right? Or the parent teacher liaison or a counselor who is hearing these sort of concerns from these parents, or these actual situations where these parents might no longer be in for example, a stable economic position, because all of a sudden perhaps the father in a family gets deported and now there's one less breadwinner, perhaps the principal breadwinner out of the family. What do we do economically, or how do we explain this to our kids? I mean, these are conversations often being had with other community members, which are teachers, which are counselors, which are your neighbors, and might have a sense of it. And so these are often things that are being figured out, I think, perhaps outside of the public eye or these sort of public institutions that we have. And I think that's an interesting question. I think it speaks in some sense to the fear of institutions right now, perhaps institutions in a liberal-leaning city like Austin, which has, perhaps even the past Trump administration, really tried to show its support for a community like the immigrant community, but now feels a bit more, or at least what we've seen seemingly is a bit more of a hushed response from public officials. And so a lot of this work being done to support individuals, for immigrants, I should say, and immigrants without status, come from individuals who don't necessarily hold a public office or a sort of a high appointed position, leadership position in our community.
Ugh. Yeah, I mean, and I'd love to know, like, we have seen in some of these cities where there's a big ICE presence or law enforcement presence working on immigration arrests. We've seen residents kind of stand up and protest and, throw things at vehicles, stand in the way of these activities. What are we seeing here in Austin? Have you heard anything like about how people are feeling about ICE and these arrests taking place?
Yeah, I think here in Austin, I mean, through the last many months, because we've seen a disruption to many different types of immigration policy and just immigrants' lives, I think we've seen community support pretty broadly and often, as I've mentioned, in ways that are not very traditionally organized. But I mean, I think some good examples that I could give is, we wrote a series of stories earlier this year on something that's a little different, but the refugee community here in Austin, and kind of what had happened during the several months when the Trump administration had decided to freeze funds. And they had done so broadly, but that had particularly impacted a lot of the longstanding refugee programs, of which Texas has one of the largest. And in Austin has a very sizable one. And so what happened when the traditional settlement agencies, which are the agencies that are supposed to settle refugees in a community like Austin, and also just the aid and support agencies, which get federal dollars to kind of offer those services around of helping them get jobs, helping them access different types of services, what had happened when all of those came to a close? Because all of a sudden, none of these staff are being paid. There is no money to be given out to the different programs that are helping these individuals. And it was a lot of support from either organizations or just individuals who were hearing about this and were stepping in, for example, to help drive refugees around, help them still be connected to services and help them when they had questions, until some of that funding was finally unfrozen because of some federal suits that were done by these agencies here in Texas.
And Catholic Charities was one of those,
yes,
right?
Catholic Charities, through their refugee arm, was one of them who sued the federal government and went through that process. Though there's still a lot of instability, I think, there. I think we're going to see in the next year, kind of get to see what's going to happen now that Catholic Charities is seemingly taking a step back because after their contract is over, because of how difficult it has been to keep this program up, I think, from their perspective. And so, but anyway, so there and in other cases, we have seen communities try to rally. And I mean, I think one way you could just see that is to go on GoFundMe and see. I mean, we run. Here in the office, we run across them all the time of different types of individuals trying to raise money for different not even loved ones, but just coworkers and people that they know in the community who are being impacted.
You mentioned previously that, Austin used to be actually a sanctuary city, and then those were banned by the state of Texas, and we are now technically a welcoming city. But I'm curious about the reaction that we have seen from local officials. Like, on one hand, we have Greg Casar. He's going to be, running for re-election again soon. We have Republicans also who represent this area. Are they pleased with the way that things are going? Are Democrats standing up? Is Greg Casar and the like, are they doing anything? Is there anything they can do? I'm just curious about how we fit in with everyone's political, messaging here in Austin.
Yeah, from the reporting I've done, I would say that, I've seen an interesting kind of dynamic of there is a desire by many immigrants and by individuals who are helping them, who are helping them through the legal system or through some sort of detention case. There's been a desire to have that pressure on the congressional offices to get more information, to help these families, for example, track where their loved ones are, because that can be very difficult at times. I mean, individuals can be moved around either very quickly or just without notice through the many detention centers that we have here in the state. And I think the congressional offices that I've spoken to of Duggett's and Casar's have heard that, but there's still, I think the tricky thing is that there's often not a lot of information being shared with these congressional offices. And so we see a desire by these congressional offices. I mean, I'm giving the example of these two Austin ones, which want information and might ask different parts of the federal government for information on this, just really not receiving it. And because of that, there's still kind of being a disconnect between the desire to help at times and the ability to help, right? And seeing quite a limitation to that.
Just to get information.
Just to get simple information. And I can list that through several, of the stories that we've written and the immigrants we've been trying to follow and being in communication with the congressional offices about those individuals and seeing how little they can help despite their desires at times to get even, here we're just talking about information, or even to step in certain cases is even less successful. But I don't know, because in some sense, we've seen a relatively muted response from City Hall in the past month since the beginning. Just perhaps with the exception of the sort of continued assertion or that APD will not become involved in this, right? That because the city controls its law enforcement, its police department, it won't, continue to escalate its involvement as we're seeing with other offices. But I think, as the very good example of sheriff's offices here in the state they're not going to have an option in the coming months. They're going to have to sign up to help in some capacity. And I think those are going to be really, interesting sort of progressions in policy to see what are the impacts of that. How much does that escalate the number of arrests and deportations here in the Austin area and in Texas?
That's a new law, right? That requires sheriff's offices to cooperate in those, or be a partner in immigration.
Yes, to require large counties, counties of 100,000 individuals or more, to sign up. And we're just starting to see the first wave of that sign up, because that just opened up, and that's going to be open up until the end of next year. And so we're going to see really how quickly, right? That might give us a sense as to which local counties, for example, are deciding to be the most collaborative and which ones not. And perhaps better than counties, I should say sheriff's offices, because they're the ones who really hold this authority. It will be up to, for example, Sheriff Hernandez, right, to decide how quickly to sign on to 287G compared to a sheriff in a nearby county.
Right. Our own Travis County Sheriff, Sally Hernandez, will have to participate in this in some way.
At some point.
Whereas the Austin Police Department, still under the jurisdiction of the city, they'll be able to still follow city priorities, city policies kind of things.
Exactly.
And is there anyone saying this is going well? This is what we want to happen? Trump was elected by a lot of people who wanted a stronger stance on immigration. So curious if we've heard any success touting.
If you can look at the Republicans who represent areas around Austin, for example, the outskirts around Austin, and they remain, I think, steadfast in their support for the current administration. And I think that shows that, yes, to many this is going at least broadly, or in some ways, the way that they're hoping it goes, and completing a policy that they do want to be seen, which is either a more limited number of immigrants, or in a sense to try to roll back, if it's possible in their eyes, but to roll back the clock and to try to be able to, as they see it, look through all these individuals that have come through the country on their own. But that's obviously a very difficult thing to do. And I think because it's a very difficult thing to do, it's going to take very forceful policy and going to have very, very forceful sort of impacts and consequences on people. And that's what we're going to see play out over the coming months and years.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time and for staying on top of this topic and really reporting on the individuals who are affected by these policies and what their lives are like. I think that's just such crucial reporting for Austinites to have in our front yard. So check the show notes for links to Emiliano's reporting. And yeah, we'll check in with you again soon, I hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Ava.
That's all for today here on CityCast Austin. You can find links to Emiliano's reporting that we talked about in our show notes. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with 3 people you think would love it too. And while you're at it, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our Hey Austin newsletter. If you really get a kick out of CityCast Austin, help support it by becoming a neighbor today at membership.citycast.fm. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. See ya!